All right, I'm surprised to see so many people here still at the end of the day. I was thinking that many people already leave a little bit earlier, but the more the better. So I assume that if you attend this conference, most of you build UI5 applications, and I'm sure that when you do this, we all know that building UI5 applications, eventually for the user, it's about consuming information, right? And then based on the information, making decisions. And I'm sure you all agree that it's much easier to consume information if it's displayed in a visual kind of way, right? If it's visualized instead of having like a plain, boring table or something like that, right? And this is exactly what this session today is about, right? We will talk about integrating visualizations, custom visualizations into UI5 applications by using D3.js and integrating this with the entire lifecycle management of UI5. I've given many presentations and talks over the past years, but this today is a little bit different. First of all, I only have 5 slides, and these 5 slides include this one and the thank you slide at the end, because the majority of this talk will actually be made up of live coding. I've already been on the other side attending live coding sessions, and I always found it a little bit tricky, and sometimes, I mean, it's tough to make this interesting, right? And let's see if I can make it interesting, I don't know. Because what we will actually do is, when we talk about D3.js, talk about this in a second, has a huge community with lots of examples online, right? I think it's more than 350 examples online. What we will do is we will pick randomly, and I'll show you, we'll live code a random algorithm that randomly picks one of these examples. We'll choose it, and then we'll see if we can actually integrate this into UI5, right? And while doing that, I will talk about the most important things and so on, and let's just see if we can make this work in, I think, 45 minutes. So let's not waste any more time, let's just get started, okay? And let's start with the basics. So first of all, when we talk about visualizations, right, I think the important basis thing that I should talk about is SVG. Because whenever we want to visualize something in a web application, and especially if we want to visualize something in an interactive way, probably the best thing to do that is by using SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. And I usually like to describe SVG as the HTML of visualizations, of graphics, right? And when you look into this, it looks, I mean, it's XML basically, right? And this is SVG markup that you can just put into your HTML document, which means also into a UI5 application. And when you do this, what you will get at the end is basically something which looks, oh, exciting, like this. Right, like a very simple bar chart, because what we basically say is we have 3 rectangles and we position them, we give them a height, positioning, and so on. And this is basically what it will look like in the end, right? And this is really just the basis of that, right? Now, we'll see later on that with these simple things, right, shapes such as rectangles, circles, paths, and so on, you can create amazing visualizations with pretty impressive effects and interactions, right? So technically, you can use this SVG thing and put this into your regular UI5 application with a standard control, or also by just putting it into a plain XML view. But then it's more or less static, right? If you want to have either an interactive graphic or a graphic or visualization that uses data that you retrieve from a backend or something like that, right? Then it gets a little bit more difficult to do this without any additional framework, right? And this is exactly where D3.js comes into play. So just in case you don't know D3.js, D3.js basically allows you to build SVG visualizations dynamically by using data and then basically saying, okay, for each record in this piece of data, this is what I want to do with it, this is how I want to visualize it. So here we see an example that's pretty similar to what I just showed you on the previous slide, but here we use D3.js, right? So we basically say here something like, okay, there hopefully is already some kind of SVG element available. I select this SVG element, and then I have some dummy data here which I want to visualize again by using rectangles, right? And then there's some D3 magic which basically says, okay, use this data here, and for each element in this data array, right, x30, 25, and 20, create a new rectangle and assign the width, which is static, and assign the height based on the x coordinate or x value, right? And what this will get me eventually is basically something like this, right? Very similar to what we saw on the previous slide, and then this very simplistic visualization of that. So if you do not fully understand the D3.js example at the top, that's okay. This session is not about teaching D3.js. This session is about integrating D3.js into UI5. And I hope I can, when I get to the live coding, I hopefully can also show you that you don't necessarily even need to understand D3.js to integrate it into UI5, right? Yeah, D3.js has been around for a long time, so if you want to dig deeper into D3.js itself, I mean, there are plenty of tutorials and so on available. That's where you can get started, right? But now the thing is, okay, we want to look into how we can integrate this with UI5. And for that, we will look into d3js.org, the website of D3.js, where we find all these beautiful examples. I do this, I have this open here already. And we see here already in this preview in the header, right, you get an idea of all these various visualizations that you can build with D3.js, that you can build with SVG, right? I think these are screenshots, but these things have all been built with D3.js that dynamically generates SVG, right? When you look on this website, there's this example link at the top where you find all these publicly available examples, right? And I already opened this over here. This is a page on GitHub, on the D3.js repository on GitHub. And when you scroll through this table, you see that there are so many examples in here. And what we'll do now is, out of all of these examples, well, first of all, we can look into how many examples we actually have there. For that, we can, of course, use JavaScript, because it's a JavaScript conference, and execute some piece of code in the console, where we basically say, okay, I put some CSS selector together that basically selects all the examples, and we can see, okay, currently there are 367 examples of D3.js available on this wiki from the D3.js repository. What we can do now is, out of these 367 examples, when you click on them, you get to different kinds of sources where these examples are hosted, right? Some of them just point to a plain GitHub repository of some guy somewhere, right? And then it's a little bit difficult to actually figure out, okay, I mean, there might be one file in there might be 10 files in there, how is it structured, right? A majority of these examples is actually built from the founder of D3.js, from Mike Bostock. And he hosts his examples either on his older examples he hosts on his own website based on GitHub pages, and newer examples he hosts on a website which is called Observable HQ, which is basically an interactive website where you can share visualizations. So in order to increase the likelihood of actually successfully creating a custom visualization here live, we'll only select a random example from the ones that are provided by Mike Bostock of any of these pages, because there the code is a little bit structured. Okay. So if we do this, we still have this is the code. So we select all the examples, we filter by links that are on observablehq.com or on this website by Mike Bostock. So this is still 77 examples, right? So I typically put a lot of effort into preparing presentations like this. But obviously, I didn't go through 77 examples of Mike Bostock of D3.js and tried each and every one of them to see if I can actually make it work in UI5, right? All right. So out of these 77, we will now randomly pick some of them. So I have another thing here, which is basically, see, another code example. Let's make this a little bit bigger. OK. So what we do here is we filter by the thing, we randomly assign a value by that, we randomly sort it a little bit, and then we just pick the first 3 of that, right? And to show you that this really generates random URLs, right, we can execute this once, and then you see some results here, and we can execute it again, and it's different, and we can execute it again, and again, and again. It will always be different, right? So it's random. So what we will do now is we will have a fourth script, which randomly does the thing, and then the last line is new. We will open the first 3 URLs. We do this, we open 3 tabs here, 1, 2, 3, and oh, you already saw one of them. Now it's up to you, 1, 2, or 3? 2. Okay, because you already saw 3, right? Okay, let's see. Okay, so So this is now the thing that, I mean, you saw it, right? It's random, you picked it. If it works, yes, good choice. If it doesn't work, well, I will not blame you. So this is now the thing, wow, that we will try to integrate into a UI5 application. Let me just have a brief look at the code so that you also get an idea, right? This is hosted on this observable HQ, and when you scroll down a little bit, you see the bits and pieces of the code that basically make up this visualization. Right, so we see here there's some D3.js code, there is some data that we can later on use for data binding, there are some additional things that we can use. I think that should work. Okay, so everybody okay with that? Yeah? Okay, let's do this. All right, so I will switch to, well, first of all, I'll show you the UI5 application that I have prepared. That's the one that we see here, right? Very simple UI5 application, doesn't really do much. There's a lot of white space that we can now use to actually put our custom control in there, right? And that's what we will do. As I already said, I mentioned it a few times, right? The key to really integrate a D3.js visualization or pretty much any other framework that does some kind of visualization is by building a custom control. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll actually go in here and we will create a custom control. You might not be able to see it, but I can zoom in with the Mac magic. This is a file which is called some D3.vis.js, right? This is in a controls folder, and you see this is completely empty. And what we also have here as well is we have a simple XML view, which is, you recognize the emoji again, this is the thing that you saw in the browser, right? What we'll do now is we will build the custom control and put the thing in there. So, who of you has built a custom control in the past? Wow, okay, then I assume you know most of these things. So, when you want to build a custom control, you typically just, first of all, need to, let's say, define the skeleton of this custom control, right? So here I call this some D3vis because before that I didn't know what it would be called. Right now it will probably be called bubble chart or something like that. If you haven't built a custom control, the syntax is very similar to creating or defining a controller, right? You have some kind of parent class and then you just extend it by defining a new class. What's very important for a control, if you think about it, right? You take a control and then at some point in time there should be some kind of way it's represented in HTML, right? So the two things that every control pretty much needs is, well, this thing, it needs a base class, right? And then it also needs a renderer, right? It needs to know somehow how it should be represented in HTML. So that we can also do. We can just say renderer, and there we have our renderer. And when we look into this, this is the new renderer syntax. If you built custom controls in the past, you might not be overly familiar with this. This was presented today, and I just built this into this preparation yesterday. So what you see here already is there is a div tag, right? And in this div tag, there's a paragraph tag with some text. So right now, this is a very simplistic custom control that we can already use and integrate this into our main XML view, right? And of course, right now, it doesn't have anything to do with D3.js yet. If we want to integrate this into our main view, what we'll need to do is we can basically, at some point here, say, I want to put the control in here, right? And you see here that this comes from a different namespace. And obviously, I need to declare this namespace first. So what I can do here is something like this. And this namespace basically points to the namespace of my control. So I made these changes. I saved the main XML file, main view. And when I look back in here, I see, voila, so far everything is fine. Because so far everything was also prepared. So now, next step is obviously we somehow need to get into a situation where we can integrate D3.js, right? So we already learned that when we want to integrate D3.js, first of all, we need this SVG tag, right? We need some kind of drawing pane where we can actually, well, tell D3.js to do its magic, right? So what we could do now technically is here have another, like similar to the paragraph tag, have another tag in here with the SVG tag basically, but that's usually not recommended for a simple reason, right? If you have digged into the way UI5 rendering works, right, you might know that whenever you, well, at least when controls are implemented in a simplistic way, right, whenever you change any of the attributes, any of the properties of a control, the whole thing is usually re-rendered, right? So now if we think about, you had a very expensive D3.js visualization, expensive in the sense of it takes a lot of effort to actually generate this, to create this, right? you do not necessarily want to re-render the entire D3.js visualization every time any of these properties that this control could potentially have changes, right? Which is why it's recommended to build this in a way that it's decoupled from the native UI5 rendering, right? And there's a core element of UI5 that allows you to do this, and this is called the HTML element. So what we can do is, in our custom control, we will use another UI5 control, which is the HTML control. It decouples the SVG from the default rendering, and that we can use. For that, first of all, we need to import the UI5 thing, and we add it here as a separate control. The next thing that we will do is, as we will create and instantiate a control, a UI5 control inside our own control, we need to make sure that this control that's instantiated within that is actually connected to the whole life cycle of UI5. When our control is destroyed, we want to make sure that the other thing that we created inside is also destroyed, and so on and so forth, right? You can either do this all by yourself, or the recommended way to do that is to just say, okay, we define an aggregation, right? And this is a hidden aggregation. Basically, we use a control only inside our control, and we don't want to expose it to the outside. And with that, once we assign something to this aggregation, it will be connected to the UI5 lifecycle. The other thing that we need to do is obviously to instantiate the control. And for that, what we can do is, typically in the init method, we just say, okay, we instantiate the HTML control. In this thing, we say, as the content of this HTML control, just use an SVG tag. And so that we can later on actually address this, select this with D3.js, we actually also assign an ID to this that we can later on use. So now this thing has been created, but we haven't really changed the renderer, right? Obviously, the renderer, we also need to tell the renderer, this internal control, this hidden aggregation, please also render this, right? And for that, what we can do is we can just say the renderer manager, render control, and we access the aggregation, and that will basically just render the SVG, right? So when we now look back in here, we see, voila, the SVG pane is already there, right? So now that we have the drawing pane, right, we can use that to slowly start using all the D3 magic. Again, here also, the recommended way to actually trigger all this D3 rendering, right, is typically an on-after rendering. Because only an on-after rendering, there we can be sure that this SVG element that we actually want to use to do the magic is actually there, right? So for that, I will create an additional method, which is called on-after rendering. And it already contains some dummy code. I basically define here a static height of this chart. The width I retrieve dynamically from the width of the current control. I log this to the console that we can get an idea of when on-after rendering is actually triggered. And I already try to use the D3 coding here to select the SVG and adjust the dimensions of this control already. So now when I go back to my code, I should see that it actually extends to the full width, right? We do this, and we will see that it doesn't work. Prepared for that, luckily. The reason is pretty simple. When we look in here into the error message, reference error D3 is not defined. Because obviously, we somehow need to load the D3.js library, right? So now, this is now the first point in time we actually need to go back to the example and see what version of D3 are they actually using. So, no, this wasn't. Oh, I'm glad we didn't use this one. Let's close this, otherwise I'll fall over. I don't know. So when you look into these observable HQ things, you typically find at the bottom the version of D3 that they are using. In this case, they're using version 5. In preparation of this, I already added the D3.js version 5 to my local UI5 project as a third-party library. And what we can do now is basically here at the top say D3 version 5. And when I do this, I save it and go back to the browser. Now we see that it actually works. It extends the width to the SVG to the full width, right? And now we're ready to actually start copying the code and trying to integrate this into the UI5 application. All right, so let's do this. Let's go in here and see what we have. So basically what I'll do now is I will just take the individual code snippets, copy them all, and put them into our on-after rendering method. And let's just see what happens. So luckily, you can do this with Control A and copy. So I will use this. I will put this in here. I will make this a little bit nicer. This is an artifact that I don't need from there. This I don't need either. This I don't need either. So then what else do we have? We have the data. The data will be a little bit too... What's this? Data will be a little bit tricky. D3.js doesn't only provide APIs to render SVG, it also provides APIs to load files, right? CSV, TSV, which is tab separated files, JSON, and so on. And you already see here await, which basically means it's an asynchronous API. Which is an asynchronous API. Unfortunately, the on-after rendering thing is not asynchronous, so we somehow need to, let's see what we do with this. So for now, I will just copy this. I will put this in here, and I will decide later on what I will do with this. Let's see. So then we have this pack function, which I really don't know what it does, but I think it's important, so let's just use this. Put it in here. Okay, we copied the pack function. Wrong indentation, but I don't care. Width we have already defined. Height we have already defined, right? That's here at the top. There's a format function, looks very important. So that we will also put in here. We have a format function. We have a color function to hopefully color the bubbles. And then let's see. Okay, so I basically just copied all the things that are there, right? Some functions and then all the code that tries to make up the visualization. So now the tricky thing is, okay, what do I do with this one? If you have worked with async and await, you probably know that this pretty much returns a promise. So what we can do for now as a workaround, I keep this here as a backup, and I will just say this CSV thing, which ends somewhere, where does it end? Wow, good code, great. It ends somewhere, at the very end. Does it make sense? Okay. Oh, this one we don't need. Okay. And then we just do then, and then we have our data, if I'm not mistaken, and then we just try to do something like this. And I just indent the entire thing, and let's see. I should have installed a JavaScript pretty print thing, but I didn't. So we see here, we hopefully get the data with this kind of thing, and we already see here with the pack function, which is called here. This is where the pack function is declared with some D3.js magic, and we see here that there we use the data thing already. Right. So what we can do now is save and pray. SAP. Save and pray. This was not planned. All right. So let's see what happens. Okay, reference emma. DOM is not defined. Okay, somewhere there's some kind of weird. Okay, what is this? Does anybody know what this is? I have never seen this. Wow, I practiced a lot, but I've never seen that. Okay, maybe it's not important, and we just delete it. Bad idea? DOM UID. Okay. Let's see. Do we have more DOM in here? DOM. Good. Let's see. Wow, I tried it. Okay. Yeah. So. Oh yeah. Oh no, it's easy. Okay, it's easy. I know where the problem is. Okay, so you know that we already here with our HTML wrapper, right? We already created the SVG pane where we want to do the drawing. The challenge is that if you take the example from the observable HQ, they typically also create an SVG element. Obviously, this we don't need. We already have the SVG, so we don't need to create a new one. We can just adjust the parameters of this, and then. Woo! Okay, surprise. Okay, it obviously doesn't look perfectly nice, right? But it's a starting point, right? And I think it's good enough from a layouting perspective, good enough so that I can show you some other examples, such as making it responsive, and integrating with the data binding. All right, because when we look into this, right, just imagine you want to actually, I mean, we all know with Fiori and UI5 and so on, we try to make applications responsive. We want to make them look nice on a mobile application as well as on a desktop. And just to see if this application, or to be precise, our custom control is actually responsive, we can just do the poor developers thing and just see, okay, what happens if I change the window size, right? And obviously, our control currently is not really responsive, right? What we'll do is, I'll show you what you would need to do to make this thing responsive, and just to see how far we get in actually making the whole thing responsive. We'll definitely extend the SVG to the right. So what we'll need to do for that, whenever you want to make a custom control responsive, well, obviously you can try doing this with CSS, right? You know, with CSS you have media selectors where you can say on a small screen apply this CSS, on a larger screen apply a different CSS. But for SVG, when you want to deal with positioning and so on, this doesn't really work, right? There you run out of the options with CSS. So you need to do something else. And let's say the UI5 way of making controls responsive is by using an additional core feature, which is called the resize handler. And for that, we can go back to our code and say we will add an additional thing here, which is called the resize handler. The resize handler, we will need to use it here. And the resize handler obviously listens to resize events of our control. What will, no, this I had already, register. The resize handler, you need to register this for your control. So you see here we call the register method. We pass a reference to our own control. This is this reference. And we tell the resize handler what should be the function, the callback that it should call whenever the control resizes. In this case, I say it's on resize, which currently doesn't exist, but that's not a problem. So on resize, and you see here we log the current width whenever the control resizes. It's important to register this resize handler in on after rendering, right? What's even more important is that when you register the thing in on after rendering, that you deregister it in on before rendering. Because otherwise, right, I mean, it's an event listener that keeps stacking up, and then you have 10 things listening to your resize event after the control has been rendered a few times, and then you sit there and you're like, what is happening, right? This has happened to me many times. And most likely you also want to deregister this in the exit method. Probably you also want to do something like this, where you say, okay, on the exit method, similar to the init method of a control, also on the exit method you want to make sure that you deregister the resize handler to clean up your control properly. All right, so let's move this away because we don't really need this any further. This here. Okay, perfect. So now we have our resize thing, and when we actually now look into our control, look into our application, right, it still looks, well, the same level of beautiness, I don't know, as before. But now when we resize this, right, you see that on the left-hand side, at least we can see that somehow it does something, right? But obviously the control doesn't really respond to this yet, right? So obviously, I mean, the easiest thing that you would probably want to do when the size changes, you just want to redraw the control, right? So the easiest thing to do this is, first of all, to decouple or to put the drawing thing into a separate method. That's always highly recommended. So what we can do is we can say something like render my visualization, and then I just have a separate method here, which I call render visualization, where I say, okay, this is the code to render the visualization. I trigger this from on after rendering, and obviously I also trigger this from the on resize event. So on render visualization, I save it, and now when I go back in here, still looks nice. And now when I change the width of the window and resize, it should redraw the control, right? So let's do this. And wow, it works. Oh, I'm surprised. It works pretty well. So you see that it always, more or less, positions the thing in the center of the pane. Wow, I'm surprised that it works. Because what can sometimes happen, right, when you, I mean, drawing something with SVG is quite easy when you do it for the first time, right? Because then you can say, for all the new data elements that I have, this is how I want to render them. But whenever you already have an existing visualization and you want to update this, right, you want to redraw this, reposition this, then, I mean, for all the data elements that you have, there are already visual representations there, right? So you typically just want to reposition them instead of recreating them. So it seems like this example that we copied is already prepared for this, because many of the examples that you find there, they are just made for initial rendering. And then if you render it again, you will basically have the visualization from the first go, and then from the second go, overlaying and so on, right? That's the point where you then need to dig into the D3.js rendering thing and adjust the examples a little bit. But for now, I think it's good enough. All right, so important thing, if you want to make your control responsive, use the resize handler and do the thing that I showed you. So now 15 minutes, good. The next thing last thing that we want to look into is how we can actually now connect this to data binding, right? Because currently we somehow, when we look into the example, we have this D3.js CSV API here where we load some kind of CSV document from somewhere. And we do this inside the control, right? Obviously, this violates the whole concept of a model view controller thing where you separate the representation from the data and so on, right? So this doesn't really make sense. So what we'll do now is we will basically do the following. I think it's this one. No. Log data. There we go. What we'll do is we will just log the entire data that's actually somehow retrieved by this API to the console. I will take this thing that I print to the console and I will move this to a JSON model. And then the data in the JSON model, it's static there. Technically, you could retrieve it from somewhere and put it into the JSON model. And then we can see how we can bind the data from the JSON model to the control. So we do this. We go back to the terminal and hope that it doesn't explode because of all the data. 57 kilobytes. Okay, that's a lot. Okay, luckily there's a copy button in Chrome. It's also a new thing that I discovered in preparation for this session. Because typically I don't log so much data. So we just copy this, and what we'll do is we will go to my component, because in the component you see here that there is already a model. Currently the model is empty, and what we'll do is basically just put the data in there. Right? So let's see. It has an array already. We don't need the array. Come on. Okay, there we go. Okay, crying for a JavaScript formatter. Anyway, so I saved the data. It's now the same data that was retrieved by D3.js from some random source that Mike Bostock prepared. It's now in our JSON model. Application still loads fine. Perfect. So now I will show you how you can actually get this data into a UI5 control. First thing that we do is we'll remove the console log because we don't need this anymore. All right, so whenever you want to get data from a data model into your control, right, you do this via data binding. There are different types of data binding. There is something which is called property binding, such as you have a text control and it has a text property or a value property or something like this, right? You bind this against some parameter and then it just shows up, right? And if you have two-way binding, it just synchronizes itself all the time. Then there's also aggregation binding, right? If you think about a table or a list, right? A list has multiple entries. You basically bind some kind of array of data to this items aggregation of a list or of a table, right? And then you say for each item in this thing, this is how you should render this, right? Now, if you think about the two things, aggregations and property bindings, right? Which is the one that we obviously want to use? Perfect. Okay, so an aggregation. How do we create an aggregation binding? Well, technically there is an API on every control which is called bind aggregation, and we could somehow do some magic to get it in there. But if we don't, let's say, officially declare that we have an aggregation that can receive data, we will not be able to do this data binding from an XML view, right? So what we'll need to do is we scroll back to the top, and here, I mean, this is where we need to add an aggregation to actually be able to receive all the data. So what we can do is we can just say we add a data aggregation here. And this will allow us to go to the XML view and say, this data thing, this is the source in the model where I want to bind this aggregation to. This is the data that I want to pass. Now, if you think about other controls, other aggregations that you're familiar with, such as list controls or table controls, right? When you specify a list, you say items come from slash sales order slash items or something like this. And then you say, for each element in this array, right, use a standard list item or use an object list item, right? And this is then later on how it will be visualized. Technically, you can also mix this, right? You can say for this kind of data record, use an object list item. For the other thing, use a custom list item or something like this. The thing is, for our scenario, right, there is not really any control that we want to, where we want to say, okay, for each element, use this control to visualize this data point, right? So we don't actually need the control. However, there, at least with public APIs, there is no way of telling this the UI5 framework, right? There is no way of just passing an aggregation to UI5 and say, but don't use any control for this, just pass the aggregation. This doesn't work. Which is why I typically refer to this as a dummy aggregation, right? And this is also why I typically use a very high-level element, which for me implies that it's a rather cheap element, right? It doesn't have a lot of dependencies, virtually no dependencies, and this is the SAP UI5 base managed object. So now that we have declared this kind of aggregation, right, we can use this aggregation, bind the aggregation from the XML. For that, I will go back in here and we will first of all, what was it, this one? Yeah. So we will basically define the template for the data aggregation, and this is again where you see this dummy object, right? This managed object. You see that it comes from the base namespace, which again we will need to declare, SAP UI base. And then obviously the data binding itself is still missing, right? So we need to do something like the data aggregation should come from the current main model that is defined, and we want to get it from the /data path, right? /data, that's the thing that we have in our component.js here at the top, right? I could also call this UI5con, and then obviously the thing in the view would be UI5con, right? The path where the binding should come from. And with that, we basically already passed the data from the model to our UI5 control. It's pretty simple, right? So when we now look back into the application, it's still there, but I mean, we didn't really change anything about the control except for adding the aggregation, right? It still does the HTML call. So, okay, so what we need to do now, basically, instead of having this asynchronous CSV call here, right, basically the only thing that we need to do is somehow get the data, right? And if you have worked with aggregations before, you know that there is something such as this, when you define an aggregation which is called data, there is an API generated for you which is called get data, right? Or on a list it would be get items or something like this. And what this would return to you is an array of all the UI5 controls that have been generated for each of these elements, right? In our case, when I did get data, it would actually return an array of a lot of managed objects. But I'm not interested in the managed objects. I'm interested in the data that's bound against this managed objects, right? And for that, what we can do is basically, we do the following, and I explain this in just a second. We say we get the data from this get binding, and it looks something like this. So what we do here is we go via the binding object, basically in UI5. We get the binding object for this data aggregation, and then you probably worked with binding context and so on and so forth, right? We can get an array of all the binding contexts of this data aggregation, right? We don't care about the managed objects, only about the data that has been bound against them. And then we map this to by using the getObject method, which will basically give us the plain JavaScript object for each and every record from the data, right? So by doing this, this is where I declared the data thing. Now I should be able to safely remove this thing here to make sure that I don't lose or get confused by the brackets. Let's first remove the bracket at the end, these two things. And now I remove this, and when I now save it and go back to the browser, okay, let's save it and hope that it works. It looks different, but I don't know why it looks different, but it works. Sorry?
It's a different viewport. You scale down the font.
Okay. Maybe I didn't copy all the, I don't know. But I mean, you see that the thing is coming from the data. Yeah, and that's it pretty much, right? That's pretty much everything that you need to do to actually bind your control against the data model, right? You have this dummy aggregation, you don't care about the objects that have been generated for that, and you just use the plain JavaScript objects behind the binding, right? If you want to optimize this further, there are some ways. If you look into other controls, such as the table control in UI5, if you look into the source code, you can find out how to actually minimize the footprint or avoid that for each element there is a managed object created and so on. There are some workarounds for that, but that would go beyond the scope of this talk. But yeah, generally that's the way of how you would do that, right? All right, so with that, I will come back to my slides, to the, where was it? Ah, this one, okay. All right, so what are the things that you should remember? It's not a lot to remember. It's actually pretty straightforward, right? First of all, whenever you want to visualize something from D3.js in UI5, right, build a custom control. You saw, it's pretty simple, custom control, control, extend, declare namespace, renderer, bam, right? Use this HTML control of UI5 to avoid that UI5 is in charge of rendering your D3.js visualization. You want to avoid this. You want to be in charge of re-rendering or updating your D3.js visualization, right? And you can do this by using the HTML control. Whenever you want to do anything with D3.js, or at least the majority of the things, do this in on-after rendering, right? This is where you can manipulate the DOM, and my recommendation is only manipulate the DOM inside the thing that's wrapped by this HTML control, right? If you want to make it responsive, use the resize handler, right? For that, it's a good idea to put the redrawing thing into a separate method so that you can call it from on-after rendering as well as from the on-resize event. And this is also something obviously that you can further optimize, that when the thing resizes, that you don't need to redraw everything, but really just need to reposition the different elements. You could spend a lot of effort into making this perfect, but you get the idea, I think. And then when it comes to the data binding, use this, what I call a dummy aggregation, where you don't really care about the objects that have been created by UI5 for that. Work on the plain binding context to get the data, and then you can just use that and you're fine. All right, that's it pretty much. I was surprised how well this went. And with that, thanks a lot. I think we have a few more minutes for questions.